Amen. Well, I've been wanting to preach this sermon that I'm going to preach this morning for 30 years. And I haven't had the sermon written for 30 years. You wouldn't want to hear any of those sermons. That was bad news. But I have known about this story that I'm going to preach from for that long. And you really can't call it a story because it's not even a whole verse in the Bible. It's a description. It talks about a man who went down in a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. That's it. But I remember hearing about this in Old Testament class back in Bible college, again, almost 30 years ago, and thinking, and a lot of us young guys thinking the same thing, like, oh, how cool, a guy who kills a lion in a pit. I'm going to preach on that. And I've wanted to for, again, almost 30 years. Go ahead and turn it, because it is longer than that, some of the context around it. So we'll be looking at more. 1 Chronicles 11. If you have your own Bibles, you'll see a couple books of Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, so it's right in the middle of all that. If you want to use one of the blue Bibles underneath the chairs in front of you, it's on page 293. Now, I especially wanted to preach this sermon about 3 years ago. My first sermon back, I had stepped down to pursue some of the film projects and things, and Brian had invited me back. I had a chance to preach, and I thought, boy, I'm going to finally preach on Benaiah, this man we're going to see. But as I began to get ready for that sermon, I realized God had been doing so much in my life those past couple years that I've been away. I needed to share the things about God being in control and loving us. And so it didn't happen then. I've thought about it a couple times since then. But then finally, Brian and we were looking at this sermon series of these characters, faithful followers of the Bible, and especially lesser known people, and it was just perfect. And not only was it perfect in that sense, but as you're going to see, it was very providential in the timing. God had a reason for waiting almost 30 years for me to preach this sermon, a very personal reason. Let's look at it. Chapter 11. We're going to be in verse 22, and this chapter is talking about David. It talks about him taking control of all Israel, being the king over all Israel. Then it talks about his army, and specifically about what we would call today his special forces. Back in that day, they were called his mighty men. And we're going to see there were 30 mighty men, and then there were 3 chiefs over all of them, and then there's this other person named Benaiah. Chapter 11, verse 22. It says, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, who performed great exploits. He struck down 2 of Moab's best men. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. And he struck down an Egyptian who was 7.5 feet tall. Although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He too was as famous as the 3 mighty men. He was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the 3, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. Now, again, maybe you can see the reason for my interest at first, especially 30 years ago. Here's this guy. I mean, what an adventurous story. He goes down into a pit and kills a lion. And like, whoa! What a story of faith. Again, an adventure. And I'm like, I want to preach on that. But when I finally got ready now, 30 years later, I did something that I had never done before in regard to this sermon passage. I asked the question, why? Why did Benaiah go down into the pit to kill the lion? Now, if you'd asked me before this, and even if you had asked other people, because I've heard other sermons and books about it, and they're like, hey, well, it's just an adventure, it's an act of faith, and that's the lesson here. And I looked at it, and for the first time, I asked, well, why? Well, what's the point of going down into the pit and risking your life to kill this lion? It seemed a little foolish, actually. Like, okay, risk your life for no real reason? And then I thought about it some more, and it seemed even worse than foolish. You know, it reminded me of, and I know some of you are already sick of football analogies, but get used to them. But this one really did. I thought about in 2006, about 7 years ago or so, Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, he'd already shown himself to be an elite quarterback. He'd won the Super Bowl. And every team looks for an elite quarterback. They call it a franchise quarterback to build our team around. You know, and if you're a Cardinals fan, you know we're still looking since Kurt Warner, you know, trying to find that person. So you know how important it is. Well, Ben Roethlisberger during the offseason was out riding his motorcycle, a little recklessly, without a helmet. And he got in an accident. And he wasn't injured too severely, but it could have been much worse. And he got criticized by people who said, you are too important to this team. to risk your life like that? And he admitted it. He said, you're right, that's irresponsible. He said, I won't ride a motorcycle again as long as I'm the quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because, again, it's irresponsible to the team. Well, I thought about Benaiah. Like, here you are. You're among the elite warriors of Israel. To just go down into a pit and risk your life for an adventure, for fun, that's irresponsible. And I look at this passage and I'm like, okay, I don't think God's praising irresponsibility. Why did he go down in the pit? Why did he do it? And I think there's some clues when you look at these other great exploits that he did. Look what it says there in verse 22. It says he struck down 2 of Moab's best men. Now, if you have one of the new NIV Bibles, and they revised it a couple of years ago, and nothing major, but it says they're the 2 mightiest men of Moab. In another translation, it says 2 heroes of Moab. So these weren't just your average soldiers of Moab. These were 2 of the best warriors. And then, of course, in verse 23, you see this person who stands out. He struck down an Egyptian who was 7.5 feet tall. Although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. And this man was a giant, 7.5 feet tall. When I raised my hand all the way up, that's 7.5 feet tall. And his spear, it says, was like a weaver's rod. That was part of a loom. And what they're saying is that's how big the spear was. How the big diameter of the shaft of the spear. And to put that in perspective, most of us, even if you're not good at using a baseball bat, like I'm not, you're probably familiar with the baseball bat. You got the end you hold, all right. This would be about as wide as the end that you hit the ball with. That's how big his spear was. And he struck down this person. And so you look at these 2 men and you realize, 3 men, 2 from Moab and 1 from Egypt, and you realize these guys would be on the mighty men list of their countries. The other exploits of the 3 that are described above, it talks about them more in quantity. They killed 300 men or 800 men at a time, or, they snuck into this place. They did this. But Benaiah went against other elite warriors. And I thought about that, and it made me think of, have you seen some of the movies with these battle scenes? It seems like there was one in Chronicles of Narnia and maybe Lord of the Rings and others as well, where there's this one enemy warrior who is just far superior to everyone else. He's just wiping out everyone. And the question is, obviously, who's going to face this guy? And of course, it's the hero's job to face him. Well, I think about that, and was that the situation? And you have to realize, and you read it in the other accounts, it's not like the other 30 or 3 were there and they go, no, we're not going to do it. It seems like they weren't all together at the same time. But here was Benaiah among the army, and he looked at that and said, I need to be the one to go against those people. We have another account of a giant, and I don't know, but the other one we probably think of is David and Goliath. And Goliath would call out, who's going to face me? I don't know if this happened there, but I get the impression there's this possibility that Benaiah went against these other great warriors, not just to defeat them, but to keep other people in the army from having to do it, to protect them. Well, with that in mind, then I look at this little description, this account of the lion. It says he also went down into a pit on a snowy day, and he killed a lion. Now, if you have the New Living Translation, it says he chased a lion down into the pit. That's not the more literal way of looking at it. It's what we have here. The lion was in the pit. He chose to go down with the lion to take him on. And it made me ask the question, all right, if this lion's in the pit, what's that mean? What's the significance of that? Well, if there's a lion in the pit, to me it indicates he fell in and he can't get out. The lion can't get out of that pit or he wouldn't still be in there. And it does say it's a snowy day, so it makes me think, all right, yeah, he fell in. Well, then think about it for a second. What's the danger that's potentially there? Someone else could fall in that pit, couldn't they? And what's likely to happen to anyone who falls in a pit with a lion? And they're going to get torn to pieces and eaten up by that lion. And I look there and I think, maybe that's what it was. Benaiah saw this lion down there, he saw this pit and realized other people are in danger here. And he went down in that pit to kill that lion to protect other people. Now, again, at this point I still wasn't sure. I thought, is that right? Is that on the right track? And I always look for a confirmation. You've heard me say that. Well, look what it says here. At the end of verse 25, it says, after all this, David put him in charge of his bodyguard. What's the significance of that? What's the focus of a bodyguard? You protect other people, don't you? You protect other people. And I think that's what it is. I think David looked at this man. He said, look at all his exploits. Look at the things he's done. He's shown this knack You know, this passion, whatever you want to call it, to go to extreme lengths to protect other people. I'm putting him in charge of my bodyguard. That's who I want protecting me. And so as I look about that, I think this passage is not about just the adventure idea of going down into a pit. It's not just about faith. It raises the question, will I go down into the pit to protect other people? Will I go to extreme lengths to protect other people? Now, what do I mean when I say protect other people? Notice, it's not just help other people. Not that they're in a situation they need a helping hand. No, there's an element of danger here to these other people. And what kind of danger is it? Well, very often in the Bible, physical examples have spiritual applications. And I think that's what we see here. There's a lion in the pit. Well, what's the significance of that? 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." I think that's the lesson to get here, that Satan is looking to harm other believers, especially spiritually. There are spiritual dangers, and we need to be willing to go down in the pit to protect other people. Now, what are these spiritual dangers that other people face? Well, I thought it was interesting. I actually read a sermon online that someone had preached on this, and he made the point. He said, you know, in the Old Testament, oftentimes Moab, again, the first two soldiers were Moabites. Moab represents our sinful nature, what the Bible, sometimes other translations call our flesh. And the reason for that, if you're not familiar, our sinful nature is, again, it's like this part of us that even after we become a Christian and we want to do good, it's this part of us that still is tempted by sin, still, you know, attracted to that. And we all experience that, don't we? Well, in the Bible, the Moabites were a little bit like that. They were related to the godly line of the Israelites, but they weren't. You know, Abraham, the Israelites came from Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his 12 sons were the 12 tribes. Well, the Moabites came from Abraham's nephew, Lot. So again, they were related, but they weren't the godly line. And so this person made the point, you know, Moab often stands for our sinful nature, our flesh. And then the other warrior that he killed was from Egypt. Well, Egypt, especially in the Old Testament, often represents the world. You know, it represents the world that we can see, as opposed to God that we have to trust in and have faith in. You know, I can see how the world's going to satisfy this need or this desire. You know, God says, trust me. That's a little harder to deal with. Egypt is that place in the Bible where you can see how everything's going to be taken care of. Now, I don't know if that's what was meant by that, but I certainly do know those are spiritual dangers that Satan will use against us. First of all, our flesh. Look what it says in Galatians 5. It says, when you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the flesh, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outburst of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. What a list. And at first, I think sometimes the things that stick out to us are these extreme examples. Well, idolatry and sorcery, I'm pretty good. No problem there. But look, these are some everyday things. Sexual immorality, lust, anger, quarreling, jealousy, division. These are things that tempt all of us every day. And then the Bible also talks about the world. 1 John chapter 2 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, again, the sinful nature, and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. That's what's out there. That's what we all see. And there is this temptation to follow that, to give into that, to turn our back on God, to face that, to not love God and love that. And it's a real danger. That's why John says there, do not love. He's talking to believers. And why would he say it? Unless there is a temptation, a danger, that he knows even believers can love those things and can be drawn away from God. You know, 1 Peter 2:11, Peter writes, dear friends, again, he's writing to believers, I warn you, as temporary residents and foreigners, again, people whose real home isn't in this world, to keep away from the worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. And he says, I warn you because I know this danger is real. Be careful. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 4:10 about a specific example. He says, Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me. Demas was a follower, a helper of Paul, but that allure of the world. The danger is real, and he deserted Paul. It is a real danger from the sinful nature, from the world. What's another danger, as I thought about this, that Satan, the lion, will use to draw us away from God? The other one that came to mind were false worldviews. What's a worldview? Well, it's just what it says. It's a view of the world. And I'm not talking physically, like are you colorblind or not. I'm talking about how you view the basic reality of the world, of things around us. And again, the Bible talks about this, Colossians 2:8. It says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elementary principles of this world rather than on Christ." And you see what's the elementary principles. It's saying at its root, there's so many specific things in the world, but at its root, the elementary principles. And there's two basic worldviews. Do you believe there's a God? Or do you believe or not believe there's a God? Basically, those are the two, and you look at the world through those lenses. And because of that, again, there's all kinds of specifics, but the main form it takes, the main result is if you believe there's a God, you believe in moral absolutes. That things are right and wrong, absolutely. And if you don't believe in God, you're just like, well, whatever feels right. Whatever's the cultural trend. However you come up with that. But it's not absolute. It's relative to things. And let me tell you, this is an elementary principle. It's all around us. Lisa she leads an after-school program at a Montessori school. And they had a training for the teachers. And this trainer came in. She's talking about different methods and techniques. And after she's gone, discussed some things, and someone raised a question with her and says, well, there is no right or wrong in this. And I thought, really? And it's funny, I told it to my 14-year-old daughter, and she's like, that's stupid. Like, it'd be wrong if you said to some kid in your class, listen, you idiot, you get this. I mean, that seems like a wrong approach to teaching. And this person didn't even realize, of course she wouldn't say that, but she's just so conditioned by her worldview to say there is no right or wrong. It's there. And it's not just a view of the world. There's also a false spiritual worldview. Galatians chapter 3. Paul writes about it. And look how he writes. Just the tone of his writing. He says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." He doesn't usually say that to the people he's writing to. "Who has cast an evil spell on you? For the meaning of Jesus' death was made as clear to you as if you had seen a picture of his death on the cross." In other words, you weren't there, but it's like you saw a picture. You should get this. Let me ask you this one question. Did you receive the Holy Spirit by obeying the law? Of course not. And he goes on to say, you received the Spirit because you believe the message you heard about Christ. How foolish can you be? After starting your Christian lives in the Spirit, why are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort? And this is a basic worldview, or I guess you could say word view, view of the Word and God among Christians. Like, do I believe that I live my life with God by grace, or do I believe that I live it based on works? And a lot of people, including the Galatians, thought, well, I was forgiven by grace, but now I relate to God based on my works. And this is all around us in churches. And we need to be aware of it. And how serious is this issue? We might think, well, hey, in one sense, wouldn't it be good if some people thought that, they related to God based on their works? Might get them to do a little more. Come on, God's up there watching you. Like, Paul doesn't agree with that, though. Look what he says in Galatians 1. He says, "As we have already said, so I now say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted," again, this saved by works gospel, "let him be eternally condemned." That's strong language. Look at other places in the Bible where Paul faces things and some very serious sins. He never says that. He's saying, let that person go to hell. Because if they keep teaching that, they're going to take you to hell if you don't trust in God and His grace. That's a serious false worldview. And then I thought again, and I'm like, all right, is there anything else, any danger, the spiritual danger that we face? And one other one came to mind, and that was discouragement. And when it came to mind, my first thought was, wow, you sure that really ranks up there? I mean, we got sinful nature and the world and false worldviews and then discouragement. That sort of seems a little lightweight compared to those. But then I read this passage in Psalm 22. You're probably familiar, that's what Jesus quoted on the cross, but David is the one who wrote it initially as he was going through a situation. And look at what he's saying. He says, "God, why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest." I look at that. David's the one that didn't say, hey, I'm having a bad day here. That is serious. This is a person, and we know how David ends, but this is a person who you could easily see just giving up on the whole thing. That's where he was. And so, again, I ask this question, will I go down into the pit to protect other people? Will I go down into the pit? Well, how do I do that? How do I protect people? And I thought, well, I just listed 3 dangers. Let's see, how do I protect them from each? Let's start with the last one. If the danger is discouragement, then I need to encourage them. But here's the thing we have to realize. Just like discouragement is more than having a bad day, encouragement is more than saying, hey, have a good day. And a lot of times we think that's what encouragement is. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says this. Paul says, I long to see you, the people, the Christians in Rome, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. Paul says, I long to go to you in Rome. Why? Well, so I can say, have a nice day. And you can tell me to have a nice day, because that's really going to help the problems that I'm facing, that the spiritual battles I'm in. If you would just tell me, have a nice day, wow, that'd be so much better. No, he's saying, I want to sit with you and talk with you, and I want to hear the things you're going through, and I want to hear how God has worked in those situations, because that's going to get me through my tough times. And you know what? I want to tell you, I've faced some difficult times, but God has always come through. And if I can help you the next time you face a difficulty, wow, I remember what God did with Paul. I want to encourage you. That's what I want to do with you. Twice in Romans, this word encouragement is linked with the word perseverance. In other words, just continuing on, keep going in the Christian faith. Encouragement helps us do that. The word for encourage means to call alongside for help. To walk with someone, not just to shout once, hey, hope things are going well, bye. It's to walk with that person as often and as long as it takes. That's encouragement. Well, the second danger I mentioned was false worldviews, and so to address that, to protect someone from that, I need to teach them. I need to admonish them. That's what it says in Colossians 3:16. It says there, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom. Now, you may not be a teacher, but every one of us can teach. Every one of us can tell someone what we know about the word. We can admonish them. Admonish means to caution, to remind them, to say, listen, that's not the path God wants you on. You know where this is going to end. Please come back to what God is saying. That's what it's talking about here. Notice it says, do it in all wisdom. It's not, listen, you jerk. What, are you an idiot living your life like that? Come on. That's not very wise. They're not going to listen to anything you say. It reminded me of speak the truth, but do it in love, or no one's going to hear the truth. And so I need to be willing to do that. And then I need to restore people sometimes when they're caught in a sin. And that's exactly what it says in Galatians. It says there, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. If they're caught in a sin. Again, that means that they've just totally given into it. They're living in this sin. They probably know is wrong. You certainly know is wrong. It says you need to go to that person and restore them. You may need to confront them, to sit down with them, whatever it takes to get them out of that sin and back on the godly path. And once again, do it gently. Don't, again, be legalistic and certainly not hypocritical. Just hypercritical. They aren't going to listen. It's not going to work. And then I thought about just in general, what do we need to do to protect people? Well, we need to pray. Because who is it that we're fighting? Who's the lion? It's Satan. And so what do we always need to do? We need to pray. And Ephesians 6 talks about this. It says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. That's the only way you're going to fight the devil. Because you see, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. So we can't just use our own reason and power and effort, but against the rulers, against the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's who we're fighting. And then what's interesting, after talking about putting on the armor, look what he closes with. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. They're facing dangers that there's no way that you can confront on your own alone. Pray to God for those people. Pray to God. Well, I look at those lists and I think, you know what? I'm guessing most of us have done all of those. At some time in our life, we prayed for people, we've encouraged, we've said, hey, here's what the Bible says. But I ask the question, have we gone down into the pit? Have we gone down into the pit? Because I think it's interesting and significant in this story. Benaiah, to kill this lion, he didn't stand on the edge and throw a spear. He didn't do that. Now, why didn't he do that? I don't know. I thought about one thing. Look what it says in verse 23 when he faced this Egyptian. It says, although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. Well, that was dumb. Why didn't you get a spear? And then maybe he didn't have a spear. Maybe he was a club guy, you know? It made me think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You know, the one's got the staff, and the one's got the sai, and, nunchucks, whatever. I think the sword. Didn't remember, but everyone's got their own special. That's his. And so, whatever it is, certainly the point is here for us. If we're going to go to these extremes to spiritually protect people, we got to go down into the pit. We just can't stand on the edge. We've got a level of commitment. Am I willing to help and even protect others? Yeah, I think all of us would shake our head yes. Am I willing to go down in the pit? To go to that length and that extreme? And the key is commitment. Think of the commitment it took for Benaiah to go down in the pit versus standing on the edge and throwing a spear. That's not a lot of commitment there. I'm just going to keep throwing spears till you're dead. But to go down in the pit, he was risking his own life to protect other people. He was going to extreme lengths. And you think about that as we think about the things we need to do to protect people. Well, I go down in the pit to encourage someone. Again, not just have a nice day, not just maybe once. That word means to walk alongside. As often and as long as it takes, will I go down into the pit to encourage someone? Will I go down in the pit to teach them? And maybe to teach them, I need to learn a few things myself about worldviews so I can help this person. That's going to take some effort. It's going to take some work. Am I willing to go down in the pit to teach them? Am I willing to go down in the pit to restore someone? Sometimes that means getting alone with them and having a conversation that's a little bit of a confrontation about, listen, this isn't right what you're doing. It's not good. It's not godly. Am I willing to do that? And am I willing to go down in the pit and pray for someone? And again, we all say prayers. But I saw this in Ephesians chapter 3. It says, I pray that out of his glorious riches, God's glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide, to grasp how long, to grasp how high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. That's a prayer. And I looked at that and thought, wow, that puts my prayers to shame. God, please be with John. Please be with Mary. Please be with Bill and Bob and George. Lord, please be with those people. Okay, next. Yeah, we've all said prayers, but have we prayed? Have we gone down in the pit to pray for other people? Am I willing to do that? Again, the key is the extent of commitment. And there's really two parts to commitment. First of all, it's the effort. Again, if Benaiah was going down in the pit out of adventure, that'd be just fun. He wasn't. Going down there to protect someone means I'd really rather not do this, but I know I got to. And he was willing to go to that extreme, put out that much effort. And then, of course, another part of commitment is just time. It's taking the time to do something. And why don't we express that level of commitment? Well, I think one reason is just priorities. For whatever reason, we think I'm doing something that's more important than doing. I've got something better to do, more important to do. I don't have time for that. I thought about it. You can't go down in the pit if you won't get off the couch. And we got to be willing to put others first, and that's the other side of that, is an attitude of selflessness that says that person is in danger. Real spiritual danger. I've got to do whatever it takes to protect that person. And that brings me to another thought. Who are we talking about here? Who's in danger? Who is at stake? Well, I thought about Benaiah, and again, it doesn't say there, but where was this pit, do you think? I thought about it. Well, where do most of us spend most of our time? At home and at work, right? So if you're going to run across anything, it's probably at one of those places or on the way. And I thought, well, maybe this pit was around the army camp. And so who was in danger there? His fellow soldiers, his brothers in arms. And what's the application for us? It's talking about people right here next to us. It's talking about the people I'm sitting next to right now. It's talking about the people who I minister with in a ministry. People who I'm with on the women's meetings and the men's meetings and the D groups. Those are the people who are in danger. Those are the people who are at stake. I'm talking about the leaders of a church, and we've seen Satan attack the leaders of this church. Paul said in Romans chapter 12, he said, I appeal to you, brothers, again, the strength of that word, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers to God on my behalf. Not just for things that are going on, and he prays for that too at other times. He says, please pray for me, because he knows the attacks he's facing. Pray for the spiritual leaders. Pray for this church's leaders. Those are the people at stake. Everyone here, people you know, and others. And then where's the other place where you might run across something? Well, it's not at your work, it's at your house. And so if this pit was close to his house, what do you think went through Benaiah's mind when he saw a lion in the pit on a snowy day when anyone could fall in? It's like, this is where my kids play. My kids could fall into this pit. Just imagine the thought that went through your mind of what's going to happen. He knew what would happen. This is where my wife walks to pick berries or get water. She could fall into this pit with this lion. That's who's at danger here for us as well. It's our children. It's our spouses. And as we think about this, again, now you're committed, right? Now, after saying, okay, well, all the stuff you've said, Steve, I am going down in the pit. I wish I could say I know that's true, but I don't think it is for sure, because I know it wasn't for me. I knew all this prior to getting ready for this sermon, and I wasn't going down in the pit. Benaiah might be a little obscure. Who here had heard of Benaiah and the lion in the pit story before today? Not a lot. But this concept of protecting others, all the other verses I've quoted, those are pretty common, aren't they? To pray for others and encourage others. We've heard about this, but I'm guessing most of us haven't been going down into the pit. We haven't been going to that extreme. And so, I ask the question, why? Why aren't we willing to be that selfless? Why won't we make that a priority? And even more important, how do we change that? How do we walk out of here today so that I am committed to going down in the pit to protect other people? And the Bible says anytime you truly want to change and be transformed, you have to renew your mind. And the thing that renewed my mind, changed my way of thinking, was to truly grasp the danger here that we're talking about. What would have happened to anyone, whoever it was, who fell down in that pit with that lion? Without getting too graphic, picture being torn apart by a lion. That's what went through Benaiah's mind. He said, that's how serious this is. Well, again, it says in 1 Peter 5:8, the lion we're facing, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Devour. Now, not every attack of Satan is going to wind up in a person going to hell, but that's his ultimate goal. To totally separate people from God. We talked about being saved. What are we saved from? We often like to push that out of our mind. We're saved from an eternity without God. And Satan is trying to get us back to that eternity without God. He's trying to devour us. And every one of these dangers leads there. Galatians chapter 5, after going over that list of so many acts of the sinful nature, look what he says. Let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living that sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God. It doesn't mean just struggling with those things. It means giving in to those things, those acts of the sinful nature. You won't go to heaven, he says there. That's what's at stake here. And a worldview that denies absolutes, well, it ultimately denies God who gives absolutes. You're not going to spend eternity with God if you don't believe there's a God. And Paul was so strong about a Christian worldview that upheld grace. Why? Because a works-based mentality. He says, if you relate to God based on works, okay, but it won't end well. You will be eternally separated from Him. And then even discouragement. Hebrews 3:13 says, encourage one another daily. Why? So that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Now, don't give a foothold. Sin hardens your heart, and then Satan's able to come in and deceive you and pull you away from God. Every one of these has eternal spiritual consequences. What's at stake here? It's the eternal fate of who? People closest to us. And you know what? That's what finally got my attention. That's what finally made me commit to going down in the pit. And it was my girls. And I said this was providential. I'd known for a long time. You see the way Satan attacks us based on the ways that we're vulnerable. And Lisa and I had even talked. My oldest daughter, Charlie, she's 14. And she's a thinker. She's a reader. And so she's exposed to these false worldviews. And we talked about it. It's like, yeah, we need to be careful about that. She's going to an art school now. She's artistic. I need to be careful about that. Darren, my youngest, she's like me in the sense she struggles with anger. And we've seen some of this and like, oh yeah, boy, that could really turn out bad. You be careful about that. And you know what I did? I didn't go down in the pit. If you want to use an analogy, I didn't even throw a spear. At best, I tossed a rock over the side. Well, hopefully it'll hit Satan in the eye and, poke his eye out. I did virtually nothing until there was something that brought this danger really home. And it made me realize we're talking about eternity for my daughters here. And ever since, I have committed to going down in the pit. I have committed to spending time praying for them. I have committed to spending time talking to Charlie about worldview. I've committed to Darren because I've admitted before I struggle with anger. I can't tell you how many times I told her and I was angry and said, don't you be angry. Like, well, that worked real well. And I realized part of going down in the pit is get a handle on it myself, or she won't stand a chance. And so that's what I want to close with this morning. What do we need to do? Well, first of all, ask yourself, who's in danger? Now, everyone to some degree, but I'm talking, do you have someone specifically in mind that you can see there's a spiritual danger here? And then what do they need? Because different situations need different things. Maybe they need encouragement. You got to walk alongside them. And again, that means being a little inconvenient at times. Maybe they need teaching, and so I have to learn it. Maybe they need restoration, which means I got to set them down and have a conversation that I really don't want to have, but I know I've got to. And then again, maybe they need prayer. And I thought about, you know what, we need to pray like someone's life depends on it, because it does. And then as we end, the last thing, what am I going to do? I mean, just very simple. You can sit here today and nod your head to everything, but if you don't do something when you leave here, it's worthless. And maybe you're the person that's in danger. I've been talking about us as the protectors, and certainly there's a lesson to learn there, but maybe you're the person in danger. And so we're going to close today with an invitation. The praise team's going to come out and lead us in this. And maybe you're the person who needs to come forward today and realize, I'm the one who Satan is, I'm in danger of being devoured by him. Either because I'm a Christian who has slid back in some way, I've got caught up in a sin, or maybe I've never accepted Christ. And so I don't have this grace to begin with. And I need to accept that grace, or I am separated from God for eternity. Satan's already got me. And he's not just looking, I'm there. And so I'm going to ask everyone to stand. The praise team's going to lead us in this. And again, if you want to come forward and talk about something, we have some people who would love to speak with you, love to pray with you about whatever's going on in your life.